Well, as psychedelia starts to come into the mainstream in the summer of 1967, we can really take a minute to sort of see how psychedelia spreads from being kind of a subculture thing that had happened in London, in San Francisco, to a certain extent we talked about Los Angeles and East Coast, upstate New York, how it spread from that into something that became almost a kind of a commodity, psychedelia as sort of national lifestyle for the youth, for youth culture and that kind of thing. Let's first talk about the festivals and the important sort of festivals bringing people together. Probably the first important hippie rock festival was the Monterey International Pop Festival in June of 1967, organized by John Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas and music industry person Lou Adler. Number of groups were at that. Most importantly, maybe in some ways, Jimi Hendrix, because it was his sort of one of his sort of breakthrough performances in this country. Also, the Jefferson Airplane, Grateful Dead, The Who, Janis Joplin, the Byrds, the Mamas and the Papas, the Animals. Importantly, not the Beach Boys, who turned that gig down. Otis Redding even performs at the Monterey International Pop Festival, and Steve Cropper, the guitarist in the group, likes to talk about how sort of intimidated they were to sort of show up with their little guitar amps and their mohair suits and playing to all of these sort of painted hippies with Marshall stacks and all this kind of thing. But it's often thought of as a definitive performance for Otis Redding. Well, compare that, and so in the period between June of 1967 and the Woodstock Festival in August of 1969, these festivals erupted all around the country. So based on that model, you could, Atlanta, various kinds of places like that, you could find these big sort of international rock festivals that brought people together now around hippie music and culture and all that went with it. So if Monterey is the alpha, the omega here is the Woodstock, well, almost omega, is the Woodstock Music and Art Festival in the summer of 1969, maybe the most famous open-air festival of the rock era, put together primarily by a guy by the name of Michael Lang. It had many of the same groups that were at Monterey, but you can add to that Santana, Crosby, Stills, and Nash in their first public performance, Joe Cocker and Sly and the Family Stone. Famously, that event had very few, and the Monterey Festival, had very few problems. I mean, when you think about putting all these people together into one of these things, think of all the things that could possibly go wrong. And it's a testament to this and many of the festivals that went on that there wasn't more trouble. There were some ODs, there were some fights, this kind of thing, but you can expect that at a hockey game. Maybe not the ODs, just drunkenness maybe. But nevertheless, it wasn't so out of the ordinary. However, things took a really dark turn at the end of 1969 and maybe put a kind of not so happy ending on the hippie era. And I talk about the Altamont Speedway Free Festival of December 1969. This was something the Rolling Stones really wanted to do, a free open air concert, but they had a tough time finding a venue. They eventually settled in on the Altamont Speedway, not too far outside of San Francisco. Michael Lang, who had organized Woodstock, helped them out with the organizing. The Rolling Stones were going to headline. They were going to be filming a movie that later came out in 1970 as Gimme Shelter. And so they waited until the sun went down so they could get good footage of the lighting. But unfortunately, they decided that they were going to use the Hells Angels to provide security for this event. And the Hells Angels were maybe not the right organization to, at least those particular Hells Angels were maybe not the right ones for that. And a guy ended up getting killed right in front of the stage. Really on camera for all intents and purposes, right in front of Mick Jagger, and it was a real tragedy and a real black mark on the hippie movement. There have been so many successful festivals that it ended with Altamont. But I think the importance when we talk about these festivals is to think that as these festivals sprung up in various cities around the country, you began to have this kind of bringing together of young people around hippie culture. Now it was very mainstream. This was happening all around the country, not just in London, not just in San Francisco. There were also these festivals in the UK. Isle of Wight is an important one for us to think about. Also, at the same time this was happening, the music was spreading via FM radio, starting very innocently with Tom Donahue, at least one of the guys who started it, Tom Donahue, in San Francisco during the 1967 period. It starts to spread this format all across the country to where every major city has got at least one, sometimes two FM rock radio stations. People got to make sure they got an FM receiver, they got to make sure they got FM in the car, and all of a sudden this music is really everywhere that radio can go in this country, and that's a considerable amount of exposure for the music. It's also a time when we can start talking about an AM-FM split. AM radio, which had been where all the Beach Boys and Beatles and Byrds hits had appeared, now starts to become the music of really poppy kind of stuff, almost sort of teeny bopper-ish kinds of music. FM starts to become the music, the stations that are really interested in album-oriented rock and the rock tradition. So when we think about AM and FM during this period between 67, 68, and 69, rock, or at least the rock we talk about in most of these kinds of courses, really follows the FM band, and AM really becomes something that's more sort of markedly pop. And again, we're talking about the American perspective on this, so for those of you who are taking this course from other countries may not sort of appreciate the AM-FM distinction that many of us who grew up in this country were aware of on a daily basis. What this all leads to is the idea of the breakthrough of the hippie subculture into the mainstream in Middle America, or something I call, can I buy tie-dye at the mall? It's something that started out as a kind of a rebellious movement in these subcultures in San Francisco and London, which then, because of national exposure and the spread of the music and all that was going on, became kind of commodified to the point where a kid in Indianapolis could go into the mall in 1969 or 1970 and buy a tie-dye shirt that, for all intents and purposes, looked like one that the hippies in San Francisco might be wearing, but had really had no experience of that subculture. It really had become a commodified kind of thing. Well, that's what happens with a lot of things when they move from subcultures into mainstream pop, but that's really what happened. We start to get into the end of 1969 and into the beginning of the 1970s, and we usually see a break point. For us, certainly, it's a break point because we're at the very end of this course. And let me just say a minute about where we'll go in part 2 of the history of rock, if you should care to stay with us as we continue to tell the story. A lot of the styles that are blended, musical styles that are blended together in 60s rock are then, as we go into the 70s, separated out into specialty kinds of styles. If you can think of Pink Floyd's, the album cover from Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon, where the white light comes in one side of the prism and comes out all these different colors. It's like the white light is psychedelia, and what comes out of it are all these different kinds of styles: progressive rock, country rock, singer-songwriter, blues-based rock. All those things come out of psychedelia, and that's where the story will take us as we head into part 2 of the history of rock. So as we look back on the psychedelic era, we talk about these ideas of subcultures, mainstream cultures, the use of drugs, the importance of drugs, and the idea of the trip, the idea of how music can be psychedelic, and how all of this lends force to the idea of musicians becoming increasingly ambitious, caring about doing music that they think will last, as opposed to thinking of it as just a kind of a temporary musical thing to sell records for a while. And this ambitiousness, this sort of conceptual nature of what happens in the psychedelic era, is really what begins to define music, popular music, into the 70s and beyond. I hope you join us for part 2 of the history of rock.